Now I would like to invite Professor Christian Welzel from Leuphana University in Germany. He's also Vice President of the Virtuous survey to give the next keynote speech of the day. Do you want to stand? Or
sure, I'm going to stand.
Okay.
Is it visible now? Okay. Let me see. Thank you, Pippa, for throwing the ball so nicely into my field so I can pick up the baton from here, because most of what I have to say is very complementary to what Pippa has been saying. So, thinking about trust, one qualification, I'm not talking here today about horizontal trust between citizens. I'm only talking about vertical trust, so into the institutions. And I'm focusing, zooming in on political trust. So this is 3 indicators I have looked at here. They are also the 3 ones that have the highest loadings in one of Pippa's scales, which is trust in parliaments, governments, and political parties. I'm summarizing them into one scale. Now, thinking about this political trust, there's 2 competing narratives in the literature. The mainstream narrative is indeed going back to Ullmann and Werber's civic culture. And the basic idea is we live in representative democracies. We don't have anymore, at least not for main decisions and most decisions, direct democracies like in Athens or so. So people do not gather on a marketplace. Well, in Switzerland they do it much more than in other countries, but basically we're living in representative democracies. And representative democracies are about a trustee relationship between parties and voters. And this is a trust relationship, so we entrust, give our parliamentarians a mandate in the hope that they act in the best of our interest. And democratic theory argued early on, if that trust relationship doesn't work, the whole idea of representation, and for that matter, democracy writ large, doesn't work. Therefore, trust is absolutely essential for a democracy to function, and if we have more of it, of that trust, the better it is. And from that point of view, scholars got very alarmist when they looked into the trends, because many people have published papers where they supposedly show that in most of Western democracies, political trust is in a long-term decline. And that could be easily the story, and has been the story, for a crisis scenario where, so to speak, the political capital of our societies is eroding and democracy itself is in danger. And maybe what we currently observe, the successes of right-wing populism, are exactly a symptom or an expression of this dynamic. So it's a negative dynamic. There is, however, another camp of scholars to which I would myself attribute, and I think Pippa also belongs into that camp. I would call them revisionists. Representatives of that are Russell Dalton, Pippa Norris, and myself. And it goes a little bit like the critical citizen perspective or the emancipated citizen perspective. Namely, we have observed in most post-industrial, mature Western democracies over the last decades a process of value change. We have seen emancipative values rising, so people place more emphasis on self-determination and on equality of opportunities. So we have a libertarian and an egalitarian component going together in emancipative values. And in a sense, this is a process of psychological self-empowerment, because people are getting more ambitious. They have higher life aspirations, what they want out of life, and they're also confronting politicians with higher expectations. So the judgmental standard is rising, and therefore reality more easily falls short of what people expect, and therefore we see, as a reaction, we see trust going down. But this can also be a motivating factor, a trigger for social movement activity, that people raise their voice and put more pressure on elites to be responsive and those in power, and that might be vitalizing for democracy. So a decline in trust, but also a rise of protest politics. Well, maybe both stories are only partially true, and the reality is somewhere in the middle. And the idea that I want to confront you with here is to think about trust falling apart in two different components. One being beneficial for democratic institutions, and the other rather being harmful for democratic institutions. The question then would be, can we disentangle those two forms of trust that might be mingled in our one measure that we usually are using? But for one, this is also reflecting what Pippa just said. So you see here on the horizontal axis, this trust scale I was describing, so trust in parliaments, governments, and political parties summarized into one index. The more to the right, the more people express trust in these institutions in a society. And on the vertical axis, you see the liberal democracy index from VDEM. So the higher up, the more liberal democracy, the lower down, the more authoritarian the political regime is. Whatever the causality behind that pattern is, what it tells us is at least one thing. If we do not qualify political trust a little bit more, if we just take it as it is, the story that more trust is necessarily beneficial for democracy is not supported. Because you see on the right-hand side, very authoritarian countries, China, Uzbekistan, Vietnam, very authoritarian, and here citizens express the highest trust levels. What we take from that is, of course, another complicated story, because it might be that in authoritarian societies, people just lying in surveys, because they are afraid that they get sanctioned when they say something in a survey that the authorities might not like. So maybe people are not trusting that much in those countries, and they just say they trust out of fear. Maybe. But one thing we would see then, or I would suppose to see that, is that we would have more response refusal in such countries, so more missing values on those questions. Why? Because classically this would be a situation of cognitive dissonance in which you throw interviewees if they feel forced to say something that they actually don't think. That's cognitive dissonance. And the avoidance behavior of cognitive dissonance is response refusal. But we don't see systematically higher shares of missing values on those questions in authoritarian countries than in non-authoritarian ones. It could also be, and that would be a takeaway from Pippa's lecture, people in those countries are exposed always to good news. When you look into media reports and to the propaganda in authoritarian countries, people are never told something bad about the government. They're only getting the good news, and that might taint their perception, so they really think the government is good and is doing good things. It could also be that those people are if autocracies exist for many decades, for generations and generations, people are getting socialized into their value systems. So, and these systems would try to enforce or enculture those values that support the system. In other words, they will do everything to hinder the rise of emancipative values and to infuse into people authoritarian values, under which they will think strongman rule is good and is what I want. All of this could be possible. However, what is behind that, we cannot say that trust in an unqualified manner is necessarily good for democracy. As you can see, the relationship is actually slightly negative. The other thing that was in the literature, and you have seen these scattergrams also in Pippa's presentation, here we see in how many countries do we see an increase, so to the right-hand side, and in how many countries do we see a decrease in institutional trust. And the pattern is not extremely clear. First of all, it's not very dramatic. The changes that we see are kind of modest in most cases. So we look here at a time span of like almost 30 years, from World Value Survey 3, so in the mid-90s, to World Value Survey 7, so the 2010s. And I cannot see a pattern here. If I look at the countries where we see decreases, they don't have many things obviously in common. You find more authoritarian, more democratic countries, you find more developed, less developed ones. There is no clear pattern. The only thing that comes to mind is that among those that lost trust is a higher share of countries, ex-communist countries from Central Eastern Europe and from Latin America. But this is the only commonality I can see here. So what this tells me is indeed we have to dig deeper into what components of political trust are helpful and which ones are not. And this is inspired by Pippa's ideas. What I try to do is to disentangle that part of political trust that is informed by performance, and I would call that enlightened trust, because it's informed, and that part in this trust measure that is detached from institutional performance. So how am I going to do that? Quite easily, I took one performance indicator that is not in it by itself already indicative of democracy. So what I'm looking at is rule of law and the absence or the inversion of corruption from TRUEDEM. And what you get then is law enforcement, or an effective, capacious state that can enforce the laws and its policies. So this is pretty much about state capacity and provision of a common good according to the laws. This is also about certainty, expectability, predictability of what government is doing. So it's the opposite of arbitrary government and arbitrary institutions. So what I'm doing, I'm regressing public trust measured from the citizens, so the institutional trust in those three institutions, government, parliament, parties, and I run a regression analysis where the percentage of people who express such trust in a country is regressed on this effective state law enforcement objective indicator. Well, you could also see it in a scattergram. You will see that countries that are above the regression line and such that are below the regression line. But what you can do, you can save the residuals from that regression. And those residuals tell you how detached, how decoupled public trust is from the objective performance that this public trust supposedly is indicating. I can also save the predicted values, which gives me the other variance component. This measures the public trust in as far as it is covered by an objective performance. So I'm decomposing the unqualified trust measure into a measure that measures enlightened trust. So that's the component that is informed by performance, and the other one that is ignorant trust in my terminology, because it is uninformed by objective performance. And now I want to see how differently these two measures are working, and are they working differently? And the answer is yes, they are. Here we see the ignorant trust component. So the more to the right, the more do people express trust, but it's ignorant trust. It's really detached from the objective performance of the institutions. And on the vertical axis, you see again the TRUEDEM indicator of liberal democracy. And here you get a relatively clear picture. More of ignorant trust is not good for democracy. Of course, the causal error could also be the other way around. So lesser democracy might create more ignorant trust. Whatever the relationship is, it seems to say that more ignorant trust is not a good thing. And this is enlightened trust. So this goes exactly in the opposite direction, and even the relationship is even stronger. It's very clear more enlightened trust is a good thing for democratic institutions if we interpret the causality here running from trust to institutions. Quite clear. So the two measures, so if we decompose the unqualified trust measure in its two components, we really get different outcomes. So it makes sense to make that differentiation. This is also interesting. So again, enlightened trust. What we have here on the vertical axis is a measure where we look into the questions in the World Values Survey where we ask people, how important is it for you to live in a democratically governed country on a scale from 1 to 10? 10 meaning it's absolutely important for me, 1 meaning I don't care. The next question in the questionnaire of the World Values Survey is asking how democratic is your country governed? And then again, from 1 to 10, 10 would mean my country is perfectly governed democratically, and 1 would mean it is not. Now what you can do then is to measure how much people, no, sorry, I made a mistake. It goes a little bit different. We take people's perception of how democratic their country is, we take this and relate this to VDEM objective measures. So, for instance, there might be a couple of respondents in the Chinese survey asked how democratic their country is, they say 10. So my country is very democratic. If you map this on VDEM, well, you have to standardize the scales before. You can calculate the difference, and then you will see in China, many people overestimate their country's level of democracy measured against an objective standard. You can also have the opposite situation, not unlikely, for instance, in Sweden, that people say their country is not so democratic when, in fact, in VDEM it's high up. So this would be underestimating. Yeah, so get over and underestimations, and this is what you see on the vertical axis. So higher up is more inflated, so more overestimations. Lower down is more deflated, so more underestimations. And what we can see here, when we have more enlightened trust, this is obviously an antidote against people overestimating the quality of their democracy in their country. And I think this is also an important piece of information. Now, of course, the next question would be, how do we get enlightened trust? My thinking is pretty much structured along the same lines as Pippa's, because cognition, information, is an important issue here. So I created an indicator of cognitive mobilization that includes 3 things. One is level of education, quite obviously. The other is how people score in emancipative values. Again, this is a process of psychological self-empowerment, high ambitions, high aspirations, and this is also cognitively mobilizing. And third, how much people think that they are agents of their own lives. This is the question in the WVS, asking people whether they think they have no choice at all, 1, or whether they think they have a great choice in shaping their own lives, which is 10. So these 3 things go together here in an index of cognitive mobilization, and you see the relationship is very, very clear. I forgot the R square to note here. I think it's 0.72 or something like this in a quadratic relationship. And then finally, if we know this, the next question would be, where does cognitive mobilization come from? This is something I'm working currently on. I call it the births to brains shift in lifetime investments. Sociobiologists talk about, when they talk about reproductive strategies of different species, they're talking about R strategies versus K strategies. What does that mean? R strategies is species, like think of fish, reptiles, insects, producing a lot of offspring and no parental care for the individual offspring. K strategies, usually found among brained species like mammals. K strategies mean less offspring and more parental care of the offspring. Now, humans usually, as a species, generally speaking, are more a K strategy species than an R strategy species, but yet you see also the difference whether it goes more to one side or the other, also among human societies. And that is very obvious if you look at the correlation, and the World Development Series indicator series starts in 1960, and then you can look it up every year since then. Look at the correlation between number of years of schooling in a country on one hand and female fertility rate on the other. It's a powerful negative correlation, -0.7, -0.8 in every single year where we have measured that. And that exactly shows you the trade-off between R and K. So either societies, women to be precise, invest their lifetime into raising as many children as possible, but with little education and skill building and human capital investment, or it is the opposite. Now the good thing is, I have very nice graphs about that, humanity as a whole is in this transition. Fertility rates are dropping everywhere, even in the meanwhile in sub-Saharan Africa, and schooling rates are going up everywhere, with a few exceptions, just a handful of countries. Think of Afghanistan and a couple of trouble spots. But this trend is truly universal, and it's happening everywhere. Societies are just in different stages on where they are within this same process. And as we can see here, the farther to the right you are, that means fewer births per woman, lower child mortality, lower maternal mortality, higher life expectancy, and more years of schooling. The more to the right you are, the more we see this process of cognitive mobilization kicking in. So these are, of course, preliminary results. I want to update this evidence now with wave 8, which has not yet been done. So this would be part of the task list. And also digging a little bit deeper into causality, because what you see here so far are basically cross-sectional relationships, and I want to add here a number of longitudinal steps where we can run panel regressions and things like this. But the basic idea is already here, and if I sum up in a final picture, of course, the world is not so simply divided as it is depicted here into a vicious equilibrium and a virtuous equilibrium, but to simplify the idea, in fact, it's a continuum, and societies can be in different gray zones in between, but these are the extreme ends of this polarity here in a stylized fashion. So what we have is this quantity to quality shift in reproductive investments, which creates a cognitive process of cognitive mobilization. And with this comes moral emancipation. So this is about emancipative values and people aspiring to be in the driver's seat of their lives and to thinking for themselves. And you get either lots of these processes, it's on the upper part, in the upper panel of that picture, and then you get enlightened trust. And if things go in the opposite direction, and these processes are not very dynamic, stuck somewhere, we get ignorant, more of the ignorant form of trust, and this in turn then has an effect on how democratic or how autocratic the political regime institutions of a country are. There is probably also feedback loops that when there is liberal democracy at high quality, that feeds back into this cognitive mobilization story and reinforces this process by press freedom and a free flow of information and ideas and things like that. Pretty much that is my presentation for today. Thanks for the attention, and I'm looking forward to questions and criticisms, of course. Thank you.